So this evening, we're going to look at someone in the Old Testament again. We've been looking last time at William Carey, and we saw the effect he had in the missionary movement. But tonight we're going to say back to the Old Testament, and we're going to look at a lady called Hannah. We're going to hear her story now, and Hilary's going to read it for us.
Okay, this is 1 Samuel 1 to 28. And it's got lots of long names in, so I hope I pronounced them sort of right. There was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zophite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jehoram, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, one was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Year after year, this man went up from his town to worship and sacrifice to the Lord Almighty at Shiloh, where Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli, were priests of the Lord. Whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, and the Lord had closed her womb. And because the Lord had closed her womb, her rival kept provoking her in order to irritate her. This went on year after year. Whenever Hannah went up to the house of the Lord, her rival provoked her till she wept and would not eat. Elkanah, her husband, would say to her, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Once, when they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. In bitterness of soul, Hannah wept much and prayed to the Lord, and she made a vow, saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look upon your servant's misery and remember me and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used to his head." As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long will you keep on getting drunk? Get rid of your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went home. She went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. Early the next morning, they arose and worshipped before the Lord, and then went back to their home at Ramah. Elkanah lay with Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. So in the course of time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, saying, "Because I asked the Lord for him." When the man Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She said to her husband, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." "Do what seems best to you," Elkanah, her husband, told her. "Stay here until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So the woman stayed at home and nursed her son until she had weaned him. After he was weaned, she took the boy with her, young as he was, along with a 3-year-old bull an ephah of flour and a skin of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. When they had slaughtered the bull, they brought the boy to Eli, and she said to him, "As surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So now I give him to the Lord for his whole life. He will be given over to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. And then 1 Samuel 2, 18 to 21. But Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy wearing a linen ephod. Each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went up with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." Then they would go home. And the Lord was gracious to Hannah. She conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord.
Thank you very much, and well done on the names. I won't talk about all of them. So let's look a bit more about who was Hannah. Well, a bit of background before we get into her story. The events we're talking about here took place during the time of the Judges, which was approximately from 1380 BC to the rise of Saul as the first king of Israel, which is around about 1050 BC. And they were times of chaos. It says in Judges, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. And Israel went through cycles of disobeying God, worshipping the gods of the peoples around them, which led to God letting them be conquered by their enemies. Israel then repented and cried out to God. God raised up a judge who delivered them and gave them a time of peace. But when the judge died, they all disobeyed again, and the whole cycle started again. And there was even civil war between the tribes, as we saw when we looked at Jephthah time before last. However, there were some Israelites who maintained their faith, and the ark of God was at Shiloh, where priests still ministered before God and offered sacrifices to him. Now Samuel was an old man by the time the Israelites asked him to give them a king. So he must have lived at least partly during the lifetime of Samson and Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, and grandfather of David. So that gives a bit of context about the time we're talking about here. So Elkanah was obviously one of those who still worshipped God. So back to Hannah's story. She was one of 2 wives of Elkanah, and they lived at Ramah in the hill country of Ephraim. Penina, I think it's the way it's pronounced, had children, but Hannah had none. And this was a source of great distress to her, as at the time it was considered disgrace for a woman not to bear children. Point to note, they didn't think it might be the husband's fault, but that's one of those things. But Elkanah was one of those Israelites who kept his faith in God. He did go to Shiloh every year to worship and sacrifice to God. And the priests operating at the time were Hophni and Phinehas, the 2 sons of Eli. But if you read on in the 1 Samuel in the story, they weren't actually keeping the Lord's commands, and they would cause a great deal of trouble for Israel. But that's another story for another time. Now their father Eli was also a priest, but he was now old, so presumably he'd handed on to his sons. But again, he appears to be another person who was still following God and heard from God. So when Elkanah made his sacrifice, as it said in the story, he gave portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. That was part of the practice. When you sacrificed, you had some of the meat for a feast. But he gave Hannah a double portion because he loved her. Now that obviously annoyed Peninnah, and because Hannah didn't have children, she kept provoking her in order to irritate her, which seemed to be quite successful. And that happened every year. Whenever Hannah went to Shiloh with Elkanah, Peninnah provoked her till she wept and would not eat. As we heard, Elkanah would try and comfort her, saying, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" But it doesn't appear to have helped very much. So anyway, how did she encounter Jesus? Well, things came to a head one year when Hannah couldn't stand it any longer. And after the meal, and she wasn't eating, they'd been eating somewhere in the area of the temple. But she got up and went over towards the temple and was obviously near enough to the temple doorpost where Eli was sitting for him to see her. And she was weeping a lot and praying to God. And she makes a vow. She says, "O Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." So she's making a pretty serious vow here. She was obviously distressed. She wanted to have children, and she continued praying silently, probably so no one heard her pouring out her heart to God and the distress it was causing her. But her lips were moving. Now Eli, remember, he was an old man. He seemed to be spending most of his time on his chair by the doorpost of the temple. But he saw Hannah praying. However, even though he's a priest and heard from God and everything else, he doesn't seem to have much insight or compassion, because he accuses her of being drunk, rather than thinking she was actually praying hard. Hannah responds to him saying, "No, not so, my lord. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I've not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I've been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Well, that seemed to put Eli in his place, because he answered, "Go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked of him." And Hannah responded, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Now it then says she goes and eats something, no longer downcast or distressed. So she presumably felt, particularly after Eli's intervention and encouragement, that God had heard her prayer and she accepted Eli's blessing on her. So early the next morning they arose, and after worshipping the Lord, they went back to the home in Ramah. Now God did remember Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And she named him Samuel. Now that actually means, in the original Hebrew, either the name of God or God heard, clearly indicating that she attributed her pregnancy to God's intervention and answering her prayer. As I said a bit earlier, Samuel basically became the last of the ruling judges, and he ended up anointing Saul to be the first king of Israel, and later anointed David. But again, that's another whole story we may look at some other time. So what effect did this encounter have on Hannah? Well, apart from the obvious one of becoming pregnant and having a son, presumably she made a point of showing off Samuel as much as possible, particularly to Peninnah. But when Elkanah went to Shiloh the next year, Hannah didn't go. And she said to Elkanah, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." Elkanah seems to be fairly sensible as a husband, and he replies, "Do what seems best to you. Stay here until you've weaned him. Only may the Lord make good his word." So Elkanah also sees Samuel as a blessing from God and encourages Hannah to do what she has vowed. Now, weaning was usually at that time carried out between 2 and 5 years old. So Hannah stayed at home and nursed Samuel until she had weaned him. Then she took him, even at that young age, with Elkanah to the temple at Shiloh and offered a sacrifice of a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine. Now that was a considerable thanks offering. Normally they'd have probably taken a lamb and some bread or whatever else. So this is a significant offering. And after having made that sacrifice, they then took Samuel to Eli. Remember, this is between 2 and 5 years later, and Eli was an old man. So Hannah reminds him, "As surely as you live, my lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. So I now give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." So she fulfilled her vow and handed Samuel over to God to serve him in the temple. She trusted God that he had given her Samuel in answer to her prayer, and released him back to God to fulfill the calling God had for him. We aren't told how Eli reacted to this, whether he actually wanted a servant or not, but he's now got one, and God obviously uses him. But each year, Hannah made a little robe, as he obviously was growing, and took it to him when the family went to offer the annual sacrifice. So she still did see Samuel once a year, but that's a huge sacrifice for a mother to make. But Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife, saying, "May the Lord give you children by this woman to take the place of the one she prayed for and gave to the Lord." So again, Eli is praying a blessing on Elkanah and Hannah. And God was gracious to Hannah, it says, and honoured her prayer and the vow she'd made and fulfilled, and she gave birth to 3 more sons and 2 daughters. So that's Hannah's story. As usual, I've got a couple of questions for us to think about. Hannah cried out to God in her distress and wasn't ashamed at weeping while doing so in public at the temple. Do we get as passionate about what we're praying for? And are we prepared to show our feelings to others? And then Hannah trusted God to look after Samuel and handed him over to Eli, who she didn't know apart from the fact that he was a priest at the temple. How do we trust God to look after our children? And are we willing to release them back to him, into his care?